around, they said, this kid is insane, man. Took up a collection just to send him to the mainland. Get your education, don't forget from whence you came, and the world is gonna know your name. What's your name, man? Alexander Hamilton.
As that audience response suggests, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner in 2009, when Lin-Manuel Miranda first proposed the idea of a concept album about first Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, a man who he claimed in his introduction embodied hip-hop, it was played for laughs. Probably because when we've mixed white people and hip-hop in the past, the result has been... yeah. But the musical Hamilton Became uses the parallels it draws between the two, not as a gimmick of accessibility, as its 90s high school history premise might imply, but to amplify and simplify what Miranda saw as their common ground. Adversity, ambition, and a kind of frenetic energy. And through the figure of Alexander Hamilton, these qualities are tied to the very founding of the United States, where just as hip-hop is used thematically, so too do the show's narrative and history give way to themes and ideas. Two of those themes being narrative and history. Because the question of who tells your story is one that Hamilton asks repeatedly, not only in its lyrics, but in its casting, its source material, its very existence as a derivative work of both history and also its main interpretive inspiration, Ron Chernow's biography, which cast Alexander Hamilton as a heroic figure unfairly forgotten, and provided a succinct entry point into America's founding myth and who else it might be forgetting. And so Hamilton was the best musical ever, and everyone loved it, and racism was over. Well, no. In fact, like the historical legacy it draws from, the musical itself has inherited its fair share of political complications. Does Hamilton question or uphold the status quo? The answer is a fucking nightmare to work out, I'll tell you that. Because the way the founding fathers loom large over the United States, both metaphorically and in some cases literally, is arguably a glorification and perpetuation of the systemic injustices they held in place. And Hamilton does indulge in this. But it's through this preoccupation with origins and legacy, the circumstances we're born from and into, and how we negotiate that both as an individual and a collective, that I think Hamilton is also able to use its cultural mythology not as a way of reconciling with or rehabilitating the past, but as a way of approaching the present and the future. Much like how its central characters' rise and fall are tied to a singular trait of gumption, so too are the musical's revolutionary potential and political flaws, both tied up in this singular tradition of founders chic. A practice that glorifies these individuals while sweeping their less glorifiable traits under the cosmic rug of denial. And even here we can witness that glorification in this audience's cheer at Washington's introduction. Like he's a celebrity cameo in a 90s sitcom. But while Hamilton does continue this trend, it's Alexander Hamilton's previous exclusion, specifically from the founders chic canon, that underpins the musical's creation, drawing a line between his exclusion from popular mythology and his status as an immigrant, using this to cast at least the character of Hamilton as an other, to make him a cipher for anyone who is othered by the master narrative. So why isn't Hamilton the revolution I thought it was? Well, this is the progressive paradox its critics are increasingly drawing attention to. That while this musical dismantles this narrative with one hand, it's kind of rebuilding it with the other. But hang on a second. I thought this was what's so great about that, not what's so this thing you like is bad, actually. And look, I do love Hamilton, I'll get to that part. And putting my poorly branded channel aside, the thing isn't necessarily bad, it's just complicated. Because as much as I might argue that Hamilton has less to do with the origins of America than it does with the idea of origins and the idea of America, about a state of flux, about revolution and change, about black and brown actors confronting a white ruling class regardless of what historical narrative it appropriates to do so, it's still white history, as historian Lyra D. Monteiro explains. And Hamilton will partly owe the enormity of its success to the fact that it is white history, familiar and appealing to white audiences. Continuing in the Broadway musical tradition described by writer Warren Hoffman as diversity within conformity. And being both white and British myself, I can confirm that watching Hamilton as part of the villain demographic is still a good time. Of course it is. Anything else would have been bad for business. And the racially conscious casting doesn't subvert that, it enhances it. Hamilton's public development began and ended with the Obama administration. From its first appearance at the 2009 Correspondents' Dinner to its first performance in 2015, 2 years before the administration's end. And I think Adam Gopnik was right in calling it the musical of the Obama era in The New Yorker. Not just because of its yes we can optimism, but because in cloaking white history in the talent, bodies and labour of people of colour, as Monteiro argues, it similarly obscures material inequality with representational diversity. As Alex Nichols continues in Current Affairs, the president will continue to expand the national security state at the same rate as his predecessor, but at least he will be black. The actual racial injustices of our time will continue unabated, but the power structure will be diversified so that nobody feels quite so bad about it. And it's what allows a predominantly white audience to feel good while watching Hamilton. In one way, people of colour are gaining control of the narrative by usurping the positions of historically white people. But, as this episode of Champagne Sharks points out, it equally affords a comparison to Jordan Peele's Get Out, where black bodies are used as vessels for white souls once their own white bodies can no longer support them. In this case, now that the original sin of slavery is too apparent to ignore. So, is that all Hamilton is? A way to rehabilitate the founding fathers now that they're collapsing under their own racist weight? This isn't the radical upheaval I was promised. Well, however unintentionally, I think Hamilton is doing that. But what makes it so slippery is its constant teasing, seemingly always promising that this isn't all it's doing. What's potentially, curiously subversive about Hamilton is not in the story it tells or even just who tells it, but how it tells it. That while its narrative might be a conventional rags to riches story, its presentation is less straightforward, breaking away from what Andy Silver and Shireen Inayatullah call the tyranny of Western linear time in their comparison to a more laissez-faire alternative. Here, one song can condense years or expand a single moment. Time rewinds, past and present tense are used in unison. And the songs themselves function as much as a collection as they do a linear progression, where this founding myth is the container for ideas of change, legacy, agency, action and contemplation, the individual and the collective. An alternative mode of storytelling as described by Ursula Le Guin's carrier bag theory of fiction. Rather than taking the shape of an arrow or spear, starting here and going straight there, the natural, proper fitting shape is that of a sack, a bag, holding things in a particular powerful relation to one another and to us. Hamilton's narrative hurtles spear-like from birth to death as brazenly as the character's own obsessive tunnel vision, but its broader musical meditations mean this narrative becomes just one of the things held within its metaphorical container, itself providing a vessel for examining this prioritization of the individual in American culture and mythology. American mythmaking goes beyond the founding of the United States, with the American dream being just as dominant in Western cultural consciousness. This bootstrap-style meritocracy that Hamilton celebrates.
Got a lot farther by working a lot harder, by being a lot smarter, by being a self-starter.
The alluring idea that success is tied only to hard work rather than systemic advantages and disadvantages. An idea propped up by these singular success stories. What Audre Lorde termed that false sense of security fed by a myth of individual solutions. The assurance that everything is in our control. But wait, isn't this whole show about how you have no control? Who lives, who dies, who tells your story? About coming to terms with an ultimate lack of autonomy. that no matter how hard someone works or how successful they are, their contributions will be diminished or erased if they don't hold institutional power. Does this show know what it's doing? I genuinely don't know. But even if how much examining Hamilton does is certainly up for debate, Who Tells Your Story feels like an invitation to reassess these myths, these beliefs, what we think we know, to consider that what feels ancient and immovable might not be so stable. This is how writer Jack Young talked about fragmentary storytelling, not something to be pieced into an illusory wholeness, but as possibility, as openings, as pathways. And despite Hamilton's spear-like narrative offering the ultimate resolution of death, the show instead chooses at the last moment to remain uncertain, to deny closure in Eliza's final ambiguous gasp. And it's not the first time Eliza has been there to go and make things so complicated. The way Eliza insists on the importance of family is reminiscent of those 90s TV dynamics, which is maybe the mythology Hamilton draws on, where women would only interrupt the man from his important man business, essentially being reduced to a refrain of, "Come back to bed, honey." And the absence of women's agency has already been widely criticised, with the show having barely more than 2 female characters. An absence made all the more conspicuous by the reprise of this refrain in Act 2.
The Schuyler sisters.
What happened to Peggy? Did she die? And theatre professor Stacey Wolf pointed out that the 3 women in the musical occupy the most conventional and stereotypical roles: muse, wife, whore. But it still isn't quite that simple. While Hamilton does reproduce these stereotypes, rather than treating Eliza's concerns as inferior or unimportant, a la the 90s, it uses her perspective to highlight the flaws in Alexander's, criticising his individualistic obsession with his shot, and maybe begins to question just what we value. Alexander Hamilton himself was far from feminist, saying of women that they are full of weaknesses. Unlike Alexander, no weaknesses here. But Eliza's rejection of this spear-like way of living, this patriarchal colonialist momentum that pushes us forward, is not evidence of weakness or an inability to match established values, but a rejection of these values altogether. Writer Lillian Smith said, "What Freud mistook for her lack of civilization is woman's lack of loyalty to civilization." A quote that carries its own problematic baggage, like being a woman is this monolithic experience, but we don't have time to get into that right now. What's relevant here is this idea of loyalty, that we should examine not only who is included or excluded from the mythological path, but also the path itself, to look not only ahead, but around, and consider if we might want to change direction. And speaking of how experience isn't a monolith, this blog post from The Quintessential Queer talks about how Hamilton also implicitly confronts how we frame revolutionary narratives, asking whose rebellion is valued, who is allowed to be heroic through defiance, comparing the revolutionaries to anti-racist organisations and finding that violence is only acceptable in the hands of white people. The function of the visual in Hamilton is to challenge a present in which people of colour standing up against oppression are seen as violent and dangerous by the same people who proudly declare allegiance to the flag. "History never repeats itself, but it rhymes," said Mark Twain. Said John Robert Colombo in a poem called A Said Poem. What Mark Twain actually said was that history never repeats itself, but the kaleidoscopic combinations of the pictured present often seem to be constructed out of the broken fragments of antique legends. A transformation that's kind of indicative of the thing it describes, but both variations feel applicable to Hamilton. The latter in how the show makes the connection between the present and those antique legends visible, and the former in how it does it in rhyme. But seriously, the fact that Hamilton expresses itself through music is essential to its potential, as music has always revolved around themes and ideas more than narrative. And it's the medium most accustomed to remixing. and Hamilton's more recent mixtape album fully embraces this ethos, giving its songs to various artists for further fragmentation. And it's a medium befitting of revolutionary action, the motivation to take action. I'll defer, as always, to the wisdom of Adventure Time.
Music is powerful, man. It speaks to a primal pit in our brains. It makes anyone want to get up and get their knees going.
Like it can sneak past your brain and get straight to your soul. Hey! Get out of my soul! Indeed, emotion is one of Hamilton's strengths, says historian Joanne B. Freeman, capturing the founding period's heady feelings and transporting them to the present. I'm not saying Hamilton is starting any kind of revolution, or that anyone will be moved to action by seeing it, but it reminds us that we can take action. Freeman continues to explain how the founding is usually taught as a stream of inevitably happy endings. By emotionally engaging its audience, Hamilton pushes people past that stopping point. And while Hamilton isn't here to challenge the happiness of those endings, it does make this moment of radical upheaval feel accessible, making these foundations feel malleable. Which is why I actually don't think the show is at odds with the mass cultural reappraisal that came at the time of its Disney release. It's the same emotional realization that now makes these monuments feel permeable, in a way they didn't before. Hamilton foregrounds the founding principle that, in opposition to Britain's monarchy, no president will serve beyond a limited term. They literally do a whole song and dance about it, which is thematically consistent with the show's dedication to change, that the new will come to supplant the old. Winning the War of Independence is directly followed by the birth of the main character's children, reinforcing this idea of new beginnings, but also how each generation should continue to remake the world, to blow us all away.
Someday, someday.
And being a live show, the production itself will always be changing, remaining open in a way that, say, film doesn't. Lin-Manuel Miranda has said that Disney's version is not a definitive production, only a snapshot of what it felt like with that company at the end of June of 2016. In A Carrier Bag Theory of Revolution, Anna Hundert writes that, maybe the only certainty is revolution. The Earth continues to follow its path around the sun. That perpetual state of revolving is not what most people first imagine when they hear the word revolution, but our planet, a container for so many brief and precarious lives, so many antique and seemingly unyielding structures of power, continues to revolve. It's a metaphor that positions constant change and endless return as central to the human experience. But it also creates this romantic image of a unified human experience in the first place. A notion I know I'm easily seduced by, but as writer Samira Naghani points out on Twitter, the issue with the idea of a shared human experience is that it's largely coded by a European whiteness, the kind of coding that treats the War of Independence as a beginning rather than a colonial continuation. I mean, we haven't even got into the experience of America's indigenous people because the show doesn't mention them once. Yeah, you get it. It's just that while we do share this revolution of the Earth, there is never one geography of authority, and there is never one geography of resistance. As I didn't grow up with the idolization of these figures, like I barely knew who any of these people were, I think it might be easier for me to separate Hamilton's ideas from its history, or to treat history as just another idea, another thing in the bag. To see Hamilton as not being about Hamilton at all, but the concept of exclusion, of mythology and change. And I still think it's about those things. I don't want to just come here white-splaining about the experiences of marginalized groups that I'm not a part of, but I do want to acknowledge how the show reinforces a colonialist, meritocratic status quo as much as it subverts it. Because whose history it's telling remains important. The Founding Fathers' legacy is like the daddy of all daddy issues. And even if Hamilton somewhat turns the tables on their history, we're still sitting at the same table. But maybe these spinning tables, these recurring narratives and revolving histories can provide a space, if not for progression, then reflection. A snapshot of where we are now. Alexander is never allowed to see the bigger picture. In the opening, as everyone around him recounts his life retrospectively, he can only sing in present tense, just as we can never gain perspective on our own lives. We can't know the future. All we know are these kaleidoscopic fragments of antique legends. And regardless of ownership, these are the legends that still shape so much of our present, that still hold power now. And I think what Hamilton tries to do is just make that power feel less absolute, less localized, using the show's emotional resonance to convince us that things that seem impossible, even laughable, can be achievable. Whether that's overthrowing monarchical rule or writing a successful hip-hopper about the first Treasury Secretary of the United States. Hamilton is about how every history was once an active present moment, how every present is the creation of history, and our history will be what we make of it. Audre Lorde told us not to believe that revolution is a one-time event, or something that happens around us rather than inside of us. And watching Hamilton, we shouldn't be seduced into only looking back at a revolution past, at how far we've come. But take this opportunity to see revolution as still always unfolding, always changing. Because, as Ursula Le Guin again concludes in Always Coming Home, it's all too easy to be deceived into believing the war is over, that we have reached the end, the final equilibrium of civilization. Maybe you'll say, there it is, that's it, but I'll say a little farther. Drink this water of the spring, rest here a while. We have a long way yet to go, and I can't go without you. In Hamilton, we see that this is what we've inherited. So, what are we gonna do with it?
I said, hey!